My fingers trembled as I held the red roses Richard had brought me. Not because of the flowers themselves, though they were beautiful, but because my 45-year-old son had never given me flowers before. In 78 years of life, I had learned that unexpected gestures of affection often carried hidden motives. "To the most amazing mother in the world," he said, kissing my forehead with that familiar smile I had known since his childhood. The same smile he used whenever he wanted something. "I also brought a few documents for you to sign. Nothing serious, just a formality related to Dad's estate." My husband had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving our 4-bedroom home in Beverly Hills exclusively to me. A mansion we had bought together in the 1970s, when he was still a successful corporate lawyer, and I was an elementary school teacher who gave up her career to care for the family. It was the house where I had raised Richard and his sister Catherine, where we had celebrated birthdays, Thanksgivings, and graduations. The house that had become my only asset and my only security. "What kind of formality, dear?" I asked, arranging the flowers in the crystal vase I had received as a wedding gift. "Oh, Mom, you don't understand these bureaucratic things. They're just some registry update forms. The lawyer said we need your signature to keep everything in order." I should have been suspicious. In 45 years of marriage with Robert, I had signed numerous important documents and always knew exactly what I was doing. But the loneliness of the past 2 years had made me more dependent on my children, more willing to trust them implicitly. Richard opened his brown leather briefcase and spread the papers across the oak dining table. Pages upon pages of legal text in tiny font, difficult for me to read without my strong prescription glasses. "Where are my glasses?" I murmured, searching the drawers nearby. "No need to worry about that, Mom. It's really just a formality. Look, I even marked the spots where you should sign." He pointed to the little yellow tabs strategically placed on the documents. "The important thing is that the family stays united, isn't it?" Family. The word that had always touched my heart most deeply. After Robert's death, my children were all I had left. Richard visited every Friday, bringing flowers or pastries he picked up on the way. Catherine called every Sunday from Seattle, where she worked as a nurse. I was grateful not to have been forgotten. During those 2 years of widowhood, I had become more emotional, more desperate for approval. When Richard arrived with gifts, my heart warmed. When Catherine called just to chat, I felt I still had purpose. The solitude of that big empty house sometimes left me speaking to myself, carrying on imaginary conversations with Robert, replaying memories only I preserved. "Of course, dear. But where is Catherine? Shouldn't she sign these too?" A shadow flickered across Richard's face, but it disappeared quickly. "Kate is far too busy at the hospital. She already authorized everything by phone. You're the only one who needs to sign." Something in his tone unsettled me, though I couldn't quite place it. Perhaps it was the urgency in his words, or the way he avoided direct eye contact as he explained the papers. At 78, I had developed a sharp intuition about when people were not being entirely honest. But he was my son, my firstborn. The boy I had rocked through feverish nights, taught to ride a bicycle, comforted when his first girlfriend broke his heart. The young man who earned a degree in business administration thanks to the sacrifices Robert and I made, working double shifts to pay for his private college tuition. Surely Richard could never harm me, right? I glanced again at the roses. Too perfect, too expensive for a casual gesture. Richard had always been careful with money, a trait I credited to the financial education we had given him. Why would he suddenly spend so much on roses without a special reason? "Are you absolutely sure everything is fine, Richard? These papers look very official." "Mom, you're worrying unnecessarily. Remember when Dad passed away and we had to sign dozens of papers at the lawyer's office? It's the same thing. The only difference is that I can bring them here now for your comfort." The comparison seemed plausible. I vaguely remembered the confusing days after Robert's death. when I signed document after document at the lawyer's office, numbed by grief and the anxiety medication my doctor had prescribed. "All right," I said at last, picking up Robert's old Mont Blanc pen reserved for important documents. "But you're absolutely certain, Richard?" "Absolutely, Mom." "Trust me." And I did, as any mother trusts her child, even when all the signs point to danger. I signed every one of the yellow tabs without reading. I signed as Eleanor Whitmore had signed hundreds of times throughout her life. With trust, with the elegant handwriting I had mastered in etiquette classes in the 1960s. I signed believing I was protecting my legacy, ensuring the house remained in the family after my time came. Each signature was a small act of faith in the son I had raised. By the 10th, my hand moved automatically. By the 15th, I no longer looked at the words, only at the yellow tabs. "All done, Mom. The family is protected now," Richard said, swiftly collecting the papers with an efficiency that, in hindsight, seemed rehearsed. I didn't know yet that I had just signed my own eviction notice. Richard kissed my cheek again, slid the documents back into his leather case, and murmured something about taking care of everything and Mom not needing to worry. He stayed for another hour. We talked about the weather, Catherine's work, and the neighbors. A seemingly ordinary conversation between mother and son. But something felt different in the air. A tension I couldn't quite identify. Richard checked his watch too often, tapped out messages on his phone with unusual frequency. "Do you need to leave already, dear?" "I have a meeting soon, Mom, but it was wonderful spending time with you." After he left, I stared at the roses in the crystal vase. They were indeed lovely, yet something about them disturbed me. Perhaps the scent was too strong. Perhaps it was that they looked identical, flawlessly uniform, unlike the garden roses I had always cherished. Florist roses, expensive, chosen by someone who didn't know my real preference. I had always preferred daisies. It was only 3 weeks later, when the mailman delivered an official court notice, that I discovered what I had truly signed. The document, printed on intimidating letterhead, was brutally clear. I had voluntarily transferred ownership of my home to Richard Whitmore, renouncing all my rights to the property. Worse still, I had signed a statement acknowledging my progressive mental incapacity and consenting to my placement in a specialized institution for geriatric care. My own house no longer belonged to me. Worse, according to the papers, I was officially deemed incapable of making my own decisions. I read the notice 3 times before its meaning sank in. My hands shook so violently the paper rustled audibly. Nausea rose from deep within, not just from betrayal, but from my own naivete. The roses Richard had brought that day were still in the vase, wilted now, petals scattered across the table, a perfect symbol of what I felt inside, beautiful on the surface, rotting at the core. For the first time in 2 years, I cried. Not the restrained tears I had shed at Robert's funeral, but desperate sobs, the kind that come when the world reveals itself as unsafe and merciless. At 78, I had become homeless by court order, and my own son had orchestrated it all. The phone call from Catherine came on a rainy Tuesday, 2 weeks after the court notice arrived. I hadn't told anyone yet about the documents. Part of me still hoped it was a terrible misunderstanding that Richard would clear up once I confronted him. The other part, more realistic, knew I had been deceived with precision and cruelty. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Catherine's voice was tense, unlike her usual warmth. "I got a strange call from the bank yesterday, something about property transfer documents." My stomach dropped. "What exactly did they say, dear?" "That Richard presented proof you transferred the house to him, and that you've been declared mentally incapacitated." "Mom, what is going on? Are you confused about anything? Are you okay?" The genuine concern in her voice contrasted so sharply with Richard's cold manipulation that I nearly broke down right there. And then I did. I poured everything out to Catherine, the roses, the documents, the yellow tabs, my blind trust. She stayed silent for a long moment before exploding in a fury I had never heard from my gentle daughter. That bastard! Mom, you were deceived. Richard called me 3 months ago, insisting that you were showing signs of dementia, that we had to protect the family's assets. I told him you were perfectly fine when we talked, but he insisted I was too far away to notice. He said you had authorized everything. I never authorized a damn thing. Catherine rarely cursed. This alone showed the depth of her rage. Mom, he lied to you and to me. He told me you were relieved not to worry about the house anymore. That you had agreed. She went on to reveal details Richard had carefully hidden from me. His calls began in December, 3 months before the visit with the roses. He had built an elaborate narrative of my supposed mental decline. Unpaid bills, leaving the stove on, confusing the names of close friends. He even said you got lost coming back from the grocery store once, and that Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor, was worried because you were talking to yourself in the garden. Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor of 20 years, who knew perfectly well I always spoke to my plants while watering them, a habit Robert had found amusing and I had continued after his death. Richard had twisted even harmless quirks into a damning story. Catherine, I am perfectly fine. My mind is clear. I pay all my bills on time. I've never been lost. My voice faltered. How could he do this to me? I don't know, Mom, but I'll find out, and I'll help you undo this mess. That same afternoon, I gathered my courage and called Richard. My voice trembled when he answered, but I tried to sound calm and steady. Richard, dear, I received some strange papers from the court about the house. There must be some mistake. Oh, Mom. His voice shifted instantly, cold, calculating. The tenderness he used in person was gone. It's not a mistake. You signed the transfer of the house to me. Everything is legal and registered. But you said it was just estate formalities. And it was formalities for you to leave my property. The silence that followed was crushing. For the first time in 45 years as a mother, I didn't recognize my own son's voice. Richard, I don't understand. Why would you do this to me? Because you're old, Mom. Because that house is too big for you alone. Because Catherine and I know what's best for you, even when you don't. But I'm fine. I manage the house, my bills, my life perfectly. You're 78, Eleanor. How many more years do you think you can handle a 4-bedroom house? How many times should we worry about you falling down the stairs or leaving the stove on? Eleanor. He called me by my name, not Mom, not Mother, Eleanor, as if I were just a stranger, an inconvenience to be managed. So you decided my future without me. We decided what was practical. Victoria found a beautiful assisted living facility in Pasadena, gorgeous gardens, activities for seniors, nurses available around the clock. You'll love it once you get used to it. Victoria, his wife. The woman who had always treated me with polite but frosty courtesy at family gatherings, who often made sly remarks about the house being too vintage and full of unnecessary old stuff. Now everything made sense. And what if I don't want to go? Mom. He switched back to Mom, but the tone remained patronizing and condescending. You signed the papers. Legally, you recognized your incapacity and agreed to the move. There isn't much you can do now. You lied to me. You deceived me. I spared you a difficult decision you didn't have the courage to make. Sometimes children have to do what's best for their parents, even when they resist. The casual cruelty in that sentence hit me like a slap. Richard hadn't just stolen from me. He had infantilized me, reducing 78 years of life experience to the initial resistance of a stubborn child. Richard, this is my house, my life, my right to choose. It was your house. Now it's mine, and it's my responsibility to make sure you're cared for properly. I hung up, and for the first time in 2 years, I cried with rage. Not the quiet tears of missing Robert, but deep, furious sobs of absolute betrayal. I realized then that the son I had raised saw me not as a mother, but as a financial obstacle to be efficiently removed. In the days that followed, I pieced together more of the puzzle through neighbors and friends. Richard had been doing what he called field research for months. Mrs. Henderson told me he had stopped by in January, worried about me, asking if she had noticed any strange behavior. When she said no, he pressed further. "Are you sure? Hasn't she been talking to herself more often? Seemed confused about dates or names?" Mr. Peterson, across the street, described a similar conversation. Richard asked whether I was maintaining the house properly, whether the garden looked neglected, whether I seemed lost when I went shopping. He had been planting seeds of doubt across the entire neighborhood, building a network of anecdotal evidence he could use if anyone questioned his actions. But the most disturbing discovery came through another call from Catherine later that week. "Mom, you need to know something. I hired a private investigator to look into what Richard has been doing these past few months." "Catherine, dear, that's too much." "No, Mom. It's necessary, and what we found is worse than we imagined." She told me Richard had consulted 3 different law firms specializing in elder law between November and December, not to protect me, but to find the fastest way to gain legal guardianship over a reluctant elderly parent. He had researched symptoms of dementia, how to document them, what kind of evidence courts would accept. He had even consulted a psychiatrist about early signs of cognitive decline in aging parents. "Mom, he's been planning this for months. And there's more. The investigator discovered that he and Victoria have been spending far more since December. A new car, a trip to Europe, renovations on their house. It's like they were already counting on extra money. They were already spending the sale of my house. It looks that way. And, Mom, there's something that will make you even angrier. Remember those weekly visits, the flowers, the sweets?" Yes. He was recording some of those conversations. The investigator found recording equipment in his car. He was trying to catch moments where you sounded confused or repetitive to use as evidence. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined. Every affectionate visit, every thoughtful gift, every moment I thought reflected filial love had in fact been part of a calculated plan to rob me and discard me. The following week, Richard showed up at my door with Victoria and 2 men in uniform. I don't know how they managed to obtain a court order so quickly, but they carried official documents authorizing my removal from the property for my own safety. When I opened the door and saw Richard standing there with strangers in uniform, something inside me died. Not maternal love that had already withered the moment I uncovered his lies. What died was the last illusion that my son still held any shred of decency. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," Victoria said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Eleanor, darling, you'll see that Sunset Manor is a wonderful place. Much better than staying here alone, worrying about maintenance and safety." "This is my house," I replied, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "It was your house," Richard corrected, with an icy tone that made me shiver. "Now it's mine, and I don't want to argue anymore. You've had 2 weeks to get used to the idea." That was the moment I saw him clearly, not the sweet boy I once cradled, but a cold, ambitious man who saw his mother as nothing more than a real estate asset to be managed efficiently. The 2 men, county social workers, were not aggressive, but they made it clear I had no legal choice. As I packed a small bag with essentials, I overheard Victoria whispering to Richard about finally being able to renovate this outdated house and turning Eleanor's bedroom into a modern home office. "And what about all this old furniture? Should we keep any of it?" she asked. "Some of it has antique value. We'll hire someone to appraise it. The rest can go to charity," Richard replied, as if discussing a stranger's belongings. But this furniture was the very soul of my life. pieces Robert and I had chosen together over 45 years of marriage. Chairs where my children once climbed, tables that held countless birthday cakes and Thanksgiving turkeys. To them, it was all just clutter blocking their modern vision. They had been planning this for months, maybe even years. When I got into the car that would take me to Sunset Manor, I turned to look at my house one last time. Richard stood on the porch, phone pressed to his ear, probably talking to a contractor or decorator. He didn't wave. He didn't show a hint of emotion. To him, I had ceased to exist the moment I signed those papers. As the car pulled away, I saw Victoria snapping photos of the facade with her phone, most likely to show friends or post online about their new acquisition. But what Richard and Victoria didn't know, what no one knew, was that Eleanor Whitmore had not survived 78 years by being naive. I had been caught off guard once, but I would not be caught again. And I had not come this far in life just to be discarded like an old piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. What I did afterward, they never saw coming. Sunset Manor wasn't the hell I had imagined, but it was far from the paradise Victoria had promised. It was an elaborately decorated halfway place, beige walls, generic landscape paintings, staff trained to be kind but professionally distant, a place where families gently abandoned their elders, leaving their lives to dissolve into institutional routines. My roommate was Dorothy Caldwell, an 82-year-old former investigative journalist who had been placed there by her children after they sold her house to pay off their credit card debt. On my first night, while I struggled to hold back tears of anger and humiliation, Dorothy handed me a handkerchief and a perspective that changed everything. "Sweetheart, I've seen this story 1,000 times in my 40 years covering crime in courts. Children deciding they know what's best for their parents. But let me tell you something. They don't always win in the end." "What do you mean?" Dorothy sat down beside me on the bed, her blue eyes sharp with the intelligence age hadn't dulled. 2 decades of covering legal cases taught me that documents signed under deception or coercion can be contested, especially when they involve elderly people. There's an entire branch of law growing around this, but I signed voluntarily. Based on false information your son deliberately fed you. That's called fraudulent inducement in legal terms. And I highly doubt you're the first mother he's tried this on. Dorothy had kept contacts in both journalism and law, even after retirement. Over the years, she had covered dozens of elder financial abuse cases and knew the patterns, the tactics, and most importantly, the defenses. In the days that followed, Dorothy became my private tutor in elder rights. Every afternoon in the Sunset Manor Library, a surprisingly well-equipped space with computers and internet access, she guided me through research on similar cases. "Look at this one," she said, pointing at the computer screen. "Flora Williams versus Daniel Williams, San Francisco, 2019. A son convinced his 76-year-old mother to transfer her house, claiming it was for tax protection. The courts reversed the transfer and convicted the son of fraud and elder abuse. We discovered that cases like mine were becoming epidemic in California. Skyrocketing real estate prices, indebted adult children, and an aging population had created the perfect storm for elder financial abuse to flourish. The first thing you need is an attorney who specializes in elder abuse," Dorothy said, jotting down names in a little pink notebook she always carried. "The second thing is to document absolutely everything you remember about that day, every word, every gesture, every detail." For a full week, I wrote. Not just about the day I signed the documents, but about Richard's entire pattern of behavior in the months before. I recalled conversations that had seemed harmless at the time, but now revealed a calculated strategy. The subtle questions about my finances. "Mom, are you sure you can manage all the bills on your own?" The seemingly caring suggestions. "Wouldn't a smaller house be more comfortable?" The remarks about my age. "Mom, you need to think about the future. You won't have energy for this big house forever." I wrote about the 2 years of loneliness that had left me vulnerable, about how Robert's death had made me emotionally dependent on my children, about my intact mental health that any doctor could attest to. I documented my daily routines, paying bills, maintaining the house, social activities, my physical and mental state. Dorothy reviewed my writings with the precision of the seasoned editor she once was. "Eleanor, you need to be more specific here. Don't just say he seemed anxious. Describe exactly what you saw. How many times did he check his watch? How long did he stare at the papers? What kind of briefcase did he carry?" Details, she explained, were what built credibility in a courtroom. By the second week, I called Catherine to share my plans. She had flown to Los Angeles the weekend before to visit me, and watching her cry in anger as she saw her mother institutionalized gave me strength to fight. "Mom, are you sure? Suing Richard will divide the family forever. Isn't there a way to settle this privately?" "Catherine, dear, the family was already divided the moment he tricked me into signing those papers. I'm not doing this out of revenge. I'm doing it because what he did was criminal, and because other mothers are suffering the same." "You're right." Catherine let out a long sigh. "And you know what? I'll stand by you. Completely. In fact, I have recordings of calls Richard made to me. I saved them because something about his stories bothered me, and I wanted to review them later." She had 3 recordings, spanning December through February. Richard's voice was clear and cold, utterly different from his concerned tone. "Kate, the old woman won't last much longer in that house. Better we make sure she doesn't waste the estate or marry some con man. If we can establish legal incapacity, we can manage everything for her." The phrase, "the old woman," would be devastating evidence in court. By the 3rd week, Dorothy introduced me to Harold Bennett, a 45-year-old attorney specializing in financial crimes against the elderly. He had chosen this field after his own grandmother had been swindled by relatives who convinced her to sign papers that supposedly protected her small laundry business from taxes, but in reality transferred ownership to them. "Mrs. Whitmore," Harold said during our first consultation in the Sunset Manor Library, "your case has very strong grounds for contestation. From the documents you've shown me and the timeline you've built, I can already identify at least 5 clear violations of California law." He explained that Richard had committed multiple offenses: fraud, deliberate deception, theft by deception, financial abuse of an elder, a specific California crime, undue influence, manipulating a vulnerable person, and possibly forgery if he altered information after my signature. "Most importantly," Harold continued, "California law explicitly recognizes that elderly individuals can be particularly vulnerable to emotional manipulation by family members. There are precedents that directly protect people in your situation." But he was also honest about the challenges. "You must understand, this won't be quick or easy. Richard will likely hire expensive lawyers. They'll try to paint you as mentally unstable, argue your age alone proves cognitive decline, and claim you're now being manipulated by lawyers like me. Are you ready for that fight?" I thought about my 78 years of life, my decades as a school teacher, dealing with demanding parents and complex administrations, the years I spent caring for Robert through his long battle with cancer, navigating hospitals and making life-or-death decisions, the strength I had found to rebuild myself after widowhood, learning to live alone for the first time in 5 decades. "Mr. Bennett," I said, meeting his eyes with steady resolve, "I raised 2 children, maintained a home for 45 years, cared for a terminally ill husband, survived the Great Recession of 2008, and stood back up after becoming a widow at 76. If Richard thinks I'll give up my dignity without a fight, he has underestimated me completely." Harold smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen in weeks. "Then let's go to war, Mrs. Whitmore." By the 4th week at Sunset Manor, something unexpected began to happen. Other residents started approaching Dorothy and me, drawn to our intense conversations in the library and the legal papers always spread across our table. The first to join us was Margaret Davis, 75, a former teacher like myself. She had been placed in Sunset Manor after her son obtained power of attorney to help with her finances, only to drain her bank account to cover his gambling debts. I knew something was wrong when he started asking about my passwords and investments, Margaret said one afternoon. But he told me it was to protect me from internet scams. How could I doubt my own son? A few days later, Robert Kim, 80, joined our little circle. A retired Boeing engineer, he discovered that his daughter-in-law had used his house as collateral for a business loan without his authorization, claiming the documents were just insurance updates. "The worst part is my son knew nothing," Robert said, his voice trembling with controlled anger. "She manipulated both of us. She told him I'd asked her to handle it, and told me he wanted her to take care of the papers. Soon, we were 7, then 12. Each resident had a story of betrayal, each one a variation on the same theme. Children or in-laws who twisted unconditional love into financial exploitation. Did you know we could form a kind of support group?" Dorothy suggested one afternoon, after hearing the story of Eleanor Martinez, a 73-year-old whose children sold her house temporarily to pay for her medical treatments, but never mentioned buying another. And so the Grey Panthers of Sunset Manor was born, a name we chose half in jest, inspired by the activist movement of the 1970s, but which quickly became our serious identity. Once a week, we gathered in the library to share our cases, exchange the names of lawyers, and most importantly, remind one another that being elderly did not mean being defenseless or invisible. Dorothy, with her journalistic background, became our natural organizer. She created a system for documenting every case, reconnected with reporters she still knew, and began mapping patterns in the types of fraud we were facing. "What we're seeing here," she explained during one of our meetings, "is not just a handful of troubled families, it's a social pattern, an epidemic of elder financial abuse that deserves public exposure." Harold Bennett offered to give free monthly lectures on elder rights for our group. Soon, other lawyers began showing up, eager to provide pro bono consultations and gain experience in this rapidly expanding legal field. Within 2 months, Sunset Manor had become an informal hub of elder rights activism in the Los Angeles area. At first, the facility's administration worried about unrest among residents, but soon they realized our group was attracting positive media attention. "It's inspiring to see our residents so engaged and active," said Mrs. Patterson, the administrator, in an interview with a local reporter. "They are proving that age is truly just a number." And me, I was transforming into someone I hardly recognized in the mirror, but someone I loved getting to know. My posture grew straighter, not only from physical exercise, but from shedding the heavy weight of guilt and shame. My voice grew firmer, clearer, as I spoke at our meetings and gave interviews. My hair, once tied back in a modest bun so as not to draw attention, I now wore loose, dyed a sophisticated silver blonde shade Dorothy had convinced me to try. "Eleanor," Dorothy said one day, watching me rehearse my testimony for court, "do you realize you look more beautiful and confident now than when you first arrived?" She was right. At 78, I was rediscovering myself, not as a victim of a manipulative son, but as a strong woman, an advocate for her own cause, and a leader of a growing movement. Richard called me once a week, always with the same condescending, falsely caring tone. "Mom, how are you adjusting? Are they taking good care of you there?" "I'm doing very well, Richard. In fact, I'm more active than I've been in years." "I'm glad to hear that. Are you making friends?" "Many fascinating people with incredible stories." I always answered politely, never mentioning Harold, never revealing the lawsuit we were preparing with meticulous care. I let him believe I had resigned myself to a passive fate, that I was adapting like a good institutionalized old woman was expected to do. This was my deliberate strategy, to let Richard feel completely safe and in control while I quietly built the case that would shatter his illusions. During those calls, I also collected information. I asked seemingly innocent questions about his work, about Victoria, about their daily life. Feeling victorious, Richard opened up more than he should have. "Things are going well, Mom. Victoria finally gets to decorate the house the way she always wanted. You know how women are about those things." "Of course, dear. Are you making many changes?" "A few necessary renovations. All that old furniture took up too much space. Now we have a more functional, modern home." Every word was more evidence that he had never intended to let me return. One day, during one of those weekly calls, Richard made the mistake I had been waiting for. "Mom, you know you can always count on us, right? Victoria and I just want what's best for you." "I know, dear. You've always been so careful with the family's money." "Exactly. And now you don't have to worry about any of it. Property taxes, maintenance, insurance. We take care of everything. You can just relax and enjoy retirement." "And how long do you think I'll stay here at Sunset Manor?" There was a long pause. Much too long. "Mom, we'll see how things go. The important thing is you're safe and cared for." But I had already heard what I needed in that silence. Richard had never intended for my stay to be temporary. For him, Sunset Manor was my final destination. 5 months after arriving, I was no longer the frail, confused woman Richard had left behind. I was Eleanor Whitmore, activist for elder rights, leader of a growing movement, and the center of a legal case gaining national attention. Until the day finally came to show him and the world who I truly was. The notice reached Richard on a Friday, the same day he once brought fake roses. Harold timed it perfectly. The court froze all transactions on my house. 2 hours later, Richard called, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Fighting for my rights, Richard. Something you once taught me to do?" "Mom, you'll lose everything." "I already lost everything. The house, my dignity, and my son's trust. What remains is the truth, and truth has no price." Silence. For the first time, he had no ready lie. Days later, Victoria called, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Eleanor, dear, this stress isn't good for a woman your age. Let's solve this as a family." "Family?" I asked. "You had your chance before you threw me out of my own home. Now the court will decide." When that failed, Richard tried Catherine. "Tell Mom she's destroying the family. The children are suffering." Catherine shot back. "No, Richard. You destroyed this family the day you robbed our mother. If you're worried about your kids, start by telling them the truth." One afternoon, Reverend Williams appeared, clearly uneasy. "My child," he began, "isn't forgiveness the Christian way? After all, it is your son." "Reverend," I answered, "Christ drove money changers out of the temple. Justice first, forgiveness after." Later, Dorothy confirmed Richard had promised a donation for the church roof in exchange for this visit. Richard went further, offering money to staff at Sunset Manor to claim I was confused or paranoid. But Jessica Martinez, a reporter, caught it all on tape. "Your son isn't just stealing your house," she told me. "He's trying to erase your credibility." Her investigation revealed this wasn't his first attempt. 2 years earlier, he had tried the same scheme with Aunt Helen. She refused. I hadn't. Public support grew. Letters poured in. Grey Panthers meetings doubled. On the eve of trial, Dorothy asked, "Are you afraid?" "No," I said. "I studied every document, every date, and more than that, I know I'm right." When my turn came, I spoke for 2 hours. Dates, sums, conversations, no hesitation. "Mrs. Whitmore," the defense asked, "isn't it natural for children to worry about an aging parent's decisions?" "If they were truly worried," I replied, looking at Richard, "they would have taken me to a doctor, not to a notary." Applause erupted in the gallery. Even the judge struggled to hide a smile. Harold presented forensic proof, clauses altered after my signature, blank pages later filled, forgery, document tampering, federal crimes. Richard's face drained of color. Harold's voice was ice. "You said you wanted to protect your mother. Then why search luxury condos Beverly Hills 1 week later? I was just considering options. Options that included selling her house, Richard stammered, but Harold pressed. 47 searches about quick sale values. Tell this jury again, was it protection or profit? No answer came. Then came the final blow, a parking lot recording. How long do you think the old woman will last? Hopefully not long. Those fees are high. At least now the inheritance is safe. When she dies, we'll sell the house and redo the kitchen. The jury froze. Harold asked quietly, "Is that what you call love, Mr. Whitmore?" Richard's silence was louder than any words. The jury needed less than 3 hours. Guilty, fraud, elder abuse, theft by deception, undue influence, forgery. The judge's words cut deepest. You didn't just steal property. You shattered the most sacred bond, a mother's trust. Reflect on the man you've become. 6 months later, I changed every lock. I tore out Robert's roses and planted sunflowers, flowers that turned to the light. My house was no longer a crime scene. It was proof of survival. I kept the crystal vase from the day Richard brought those roses. It is never empty now. Flowers from friends, from Catherine, from Edward. The vase hasn't changed. The hands that bring the flowers have, sometimes, the best revenge is simply to flourish. And you? Would you have signed those papers? Trusting your own child? Tell me in the comments.